February 1945. The island of Iwo Jima trembles under the relentless thunder of American naval guns. Black volcanic sand clings to the boots of U.S. Marines as they crawl toward a jagged ridge known as Suribachi. Smoke rolls across the battlefield like a living thing, wrapping the men in darkness. From the caves above, unseen Japanese defenders open fire, their machine guns flashing like lightning in the cliffs. Every step forward feels like walking into the mouth of the earth itself. Then comes a new sound, deep, mechanical, and terrifying. A Marine kneels behind a rock, grips the heavy nozzle of a flamethrower, and squeezes the trigger. A stream of liquid fire bursts forth, reaching far beyond what anyone expects. The flame snakes into the cave, curling around corners, filling the tunnel with roaring heat. In seconds, the gunfire stops. Only the hiss of burning fuel remains. For the first time, Japanese soldiers hidden deep underground realize something unimaginable. The Americans have brought fire itself into the heart of their sanctuaries. The battle for the Pacific will never be the same again. By the middle of World War II, the Pacific Ocean had become a vast killing ground stretching from the jungles of New Guinea to the lonely coral atolls of the Central Pacific. Every island was a fortress, every ridge and cave a trap waiting for men who would not turn back. Japan's empire, once expanding across Asia with unstoppable momentum, was now defending its conquered territory inch by inch. Yet the Japanese army had no intention of surrendering easily. When American forces began their counteroffensive in 1942, first at Guadalcanal and then across the Solomon Islands, they learned that Japanese soldiers would not retreat, no matter how hopeless the situation became. It was a war of annihilation fought in jungles, swamps, and beaches soaked in blood. By 1943, the U.S. Marine Corps understood that every new island taken would cost thousands of lives. Each battle revealed new lessons in pain, endurance, and the grim ingenuity of an enemy determined to die for the emperor. Japanese military engineers had begun constructing vast networks of defensive positions underground, bunkers, tunnels, and fortified caves carved into volcanic rock. They were not random shelters, but carefully designed labyrinths meant to absorb artillery, air raids, and naval bombardment. Command centers, sleeping quarters, ammunition depots, and firing points were connected by hidden tunnels. When the shelling stopped, the defenders emerged, alive and ready to fight again. At Tarawa in 1943, Marines faced their first major test against these fortifications. The battle lasted only 3 days, yet the cost was enormous. Thousands of Marines were cut down by machine guns and mortars as they waded ashore. Even after tanks and naval guns tore the island apart, Japanese soldiers fought from bunkers that refused to die. At Saipan in 1944, the pattern repeated itself. Bombardment flattened the landscape, but deep caves allowed the defenders to survive. The result was a nightmare of close-quarter fighting, where Marines had to crawl, burn, and blast their way through every meter of enemy territory. Traditional infantry tactics, rifles, grenades, and mortars proved insufficient against men hidden behind layers of stone. Tanks could crush pillboxes, but were helpless against enemies buried in cliffs. Artillery and bombing runs could shake the ground, but rarely destroy the underground maze. The Japanese had effectively turned nature itself into a weapon. Their cave systems became both sanctuary and tomb. American commanders realized that victory in the Pacific would depend on one brutal truth. To win, they had to dig the enemy out of the ground. That meant finding a weapon capable of reaching where bullets and shells could not. Something that could fill the darkness of a cave and end the fight in seconds. Flamethrowers had existed since World War I, but they were unreliable, heavy, and dangerous to the men who carried them. Early models could barely reach 30 feet, forcing the operator to expose himself to gunfire. In the Pacific, that meant almost certain death. Still, the Marines carried them, experimenting in combat, learning through blood how to make them work. The first flame weapons used in jungle warfare were often improvised: fuel tanks from crashed aircraft, pipes, and valves repurposed into deadly devices. By 1944, however, American engineers began producing specialized models designed for the harsh conditions of the islands. The most famous was the M2 Flamethrower, a backpack unit fueled by thickened gasoline, napalm, and pressurized nitrogen. It could throw a stream of fire over 100 feet, and when modified in the field, sometimes much farther. The weapon turned out to be devastating against caves, trenches, and pillboxes. Its psychological effect was as powerful as its physical destruction. Japanese soldiers, trained to fight until death, now faced a weapon that stripped them of all concealment. Fire did not respect stone or courage. It devoured air, burned oxygen, and forced men out of hiding. The Pacific War was about to become a war of flame and fear. The stage was set for the battles that would define this new kind of warfare. Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each a lesson in brutality and adaptation. The Marines, scarred and hardened, carried their new weapon forward, step by step, island by island, into the inferno of the Japanese Empire. And as the fighting intensified, the United States would learn to refine both the weapon and the tactics that used it. The next stage of the story would not be about invention. It would be about evolution, necessity, and the grim science of survival in the world's most unforgiving battlefield. The deeper the Marines pushed into the Pacific, the more the war transformed into something unrecognizable. It was no longer a contest of open battlefields or rapid maneuvers. It became a siege war fought over inches of ground, over the entrance of a single cave that could hold 50 men. In this dark environment, the flamethrower found its terrible purpose. The U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service, working with the Marine Corps, refined the weapon to suit the brutal terrain. The M2 flamethrower became lighter and more reliable. Its pressurized tanks could project a stream of burning fuel as far as 120 to 150 feet under ideal conditions. The fuel mixture, gasoline thickened with a sticky compound, clung to everything it touched. Rocks, roots, and even the air seemed to catch fire. Within seconds, temperatures inside the target area could reach nearly 1,000 degrees Celsius. For defenders hidden in caves or bunkers, there was no escape. The weapon's effect on morale was immediate and profound. Reports from field commanders noted that entire positions surrendered after a single burst. Others described how cave systems fell silent once the fire swept through, leaving only the crackle of flame and the smell of scorched earth. For the Marines, it was a grim relief. They no longer had to crawl into the tunnels with pistols and grenades. The flamethrower could do what no bullet could, consume the air and end resistance without a fight. But the moral weight of such power was undeniable. Many Marines later admitted that using a flamethrower left a lasting scar on their conscience. It was personal in a way other weapons were not. The operator could hear the screams, feel the heat radiating back, and see the immediate result of his actions. Some described it as the most effective weapon in the Pacific, and the most haunting. At the same time, the Japanese soldiers saw the weapon as a symbol of terror. Trained under the Bushido code to fight to the death, surrender was considered disgraceful. Yet the flamethrower forced even the most devoted defenders to face an impossible choice: die by fire or die by bullet. Inside those caves, there was nowhere to hide. Even reinforced doors or stone walls could not stop the searing blast of burning fuel. It could turn a carefully prepared defensive position into an oven in seconds. Japanese military records later revealed the shock and confusion caused by these weapons. Reports from surviving officers described them as inhuman fire attacks, and many urged the construction of even deeper tunnels or multiple escape shafts. But time and resources were running out. By late 1944, Japan was losing its ability to reinforce its island garrisons. Many soldiers were abandoned, left to fight alone in isolated strongholds. Meanwhile, the Americans began integrating flame weapons into every level of their assault doctrine. Infantry units carried portable flamethrowers. engineers developed tank-mounted flamethrowers, replacing machine guns or cannons with flame projectors. These flame tanks, as the troops called them, became critical for attacking large cave complexes. Their fuel capacity and protection allowed them to clear multiple targets without exposing the operator to direct fire. The coordination between flamethrower units, tanks, and infantry became an art of destruction. First came suppressive fire from rifles and machine guns. Then, engineers marked cave entrances. Finally, the flamethrower team moved in, covering the target with liquid fire until resistance ceased. It was methodical, deadly, and horrifyingly efficient. Each new battle became a laboratory for refinement. At Peleliu, where temperatures reached unbearable extremes, flamethrower operators learned to conserve fuel and coordinate with demolitions. At Saipan, tanks equipped with the Navy's CBH-1 system extended the range even further, turning once impregnable cliffs into walls of flame. The U.S. forces discovered that fire did more than kill. It denied the enemy the will to fight. Back home, few Americans fully understood what these weapons were doing on the front lines. War correspondents rarely described them in detail. Photographers often turned their lenses away from the aftermath. Even among soldiers, there was an unspoken rule. Some things were not to be discussed. Yet the success of the weapon could not be ignored. It saved lives, shortened battles, and broke the strongest defenses Japan had built. As 1945 approached, the stage was set for the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War. The islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa loomed ahead, fortresses carved from stone, defended by men who would rather die than surrender. The Americans were ready to meet them with every weapon they had, including the one that brought fire into the darkness. And when that fire finally reached deep inside the caves of Iwo Jima, it would redefine not just the nature of battle, but the meaning of survival itself. War, at its core, is shaped not only by weapons, but by the people who wield them. The story of the flamethrower in the Pacific was not just about technology. It was about endurance, fear, and the confrontation between two vastly different worlds of thought. Each burst of flame represented the collision of human willpower, tactical innovation, and ancient belief. For the American Marine, the war was a relentless grind forward. The heat, the smell, the exhaustion. Each day felt like an eternity under the sun. The flamethrower man, carrying nearly 70 pounds of volatile fuel on his back, became one of the most vulnerable figures on the battlefield. Japanese soldiers targeted him first, knowing the damage he could inflict. Yet, despite the danger, these operators volunteered for one of the most feared roles in the Pacific. They often described it as a duty more than a choice. Their comrades depended on them to clear the caves, and without them, progress would halt. Air training was practical but brutal. They learned how to ignite a stream of fuel without setting themselves ablaze, how to move low and steady while carrying a bomb on their back. In the chaos of combat, there was no second chance. One bullet, one spark, could turn them into a living torch. And still, they advanced, crawling forward under fire, aiming for the black mouths of the caves, where the enemy waited unseen. Many were barely 20 years old, fighting an invisible opponent in tunnels older than they were. The psychological effect of the weapon was immense. Veterans recalled how the sound of the flamethrower alone could change the course of a skirmish. The roaring hiss, the sudden burst of light, it was more than an attack. It was a transformation of the battlefield. Marines who had faced ambush after ambush finally had something that made the enemy fear them back. Yet, for all its power, few who used it took pride in it. Many spoke afterward of how it haunted them, how the smell and the memories stayed long after the war ended. On the other side of the conflict, the Japanese defenders lived in a world of silence and shadow. Their underground fortresses were both home and grave. They endured hunger, thirst, and the suffocating heat of the caves. Many had not seen daylight for weeks. They believed that death in battle was an honor, that surrender would disgrace their families. Officers told them the Americans were barbarians who took no prisoners, reinforcing their determination to fight to the last. When the flamethrower arrived, it shattered that code of certainty. The caves that once promised safety turned into traps of unbearable heat and smoke. Japanese soldiers, trained to fight in darkness, were suddenly forced into the open, blinded and gasping for air. Some chose suicide rather than face the flames. Others charged blindly toward the source, dying in futile bravery. The weapon stripped away the illusions of invincibility that had sustained them for years. Tactically, the Americans adapted with ruthless precision. Infantry assaults evolved into coordinated fire and flame operations. The flamethrower was never used in isolation. It became part of a symphony of destruction. Riflemen provided covering fire. Tanks stood ready to obliterate escape routes. Demolition teams sealed entrances after the flames subsided. Each assault followed a grim rhythm: locate, burn, seal, move. The efficiency of this method was undeniable, and it turned the tide of many battles that might have lasted weeks into days. The integration of flamethrowers with armored support was perhaps the most significant tactical advancement of the Pacific War. The concept was simple but devastating. Tanks like the M4 Sherman were modified with flame projectors, allowing them to unleash streams of burning fuel hundreds of feet long. These flame tanks, often accompanied by engineers and infantry, became the spearhead of assaults on heavily fortified positions. At Iwo Jima, such tanks cleared cave systems that had resisted days of bombardment. The Japanese soldiers, who once believed their tunnels made them invulnerable, discovered that no depth could protect them from the consuming fire. Yet even in victory, the weapon carried a moral burden. Commanders often spoke with unease about its use. General Holland Smith, who led the Marine assaults on Saipan and Iwo Jima, admitted privately that he hated what it represented, but could not deny its effectiveness. To him, the flamethrower was not a weapon of choice, but of necessity. "There was no other way," one officer said, summarizing the sentiment of many. The American public back home rarely saw this side of the war. Newsreels showed images of bravery and triumph, not the inferno of the caves. Soldiers themselves avoided speaking about it. The war demanded results, not reflection. But inside every Marine who carried the weapon, there was an understanding that they had crossed a line few would ever comprehend. For the Japanese, the flame symbolized the end of an era, the moment when even the most disciplined defense met a force beyond courage. For the Americans, it was the embodiment of total war, where survival required harnessing destruction on a scale humanity had never known. By 1945, both sides had been transformed by what they had seen. The caves of Iwo Jima and Okinawa would become the final testing grounds for this weapon of terror and necessity. And when those battles began, the flame would not only decide victory, but reveal the full cost of human endurance in a war that left no room for mercy. Technology in war often evolves faster than the men who use it can comprehend. In the Pacific, the flamethrower represented the intersection of raw engineering and desperate necessity. American scientists, engineers, and field technicians worked tirelessly to extend its range, increase its fuel capacity, and make it safer for the operator. Though safe was a relative term when carrying 2 tanks of flammable liquid under enemy fire. The leap from the early portable models to the tank-mounted systems was a revolution. Engineers learned that by mixing gasoline with napalm, a sticky gel first developed at Harvard in 1942, they could create a weapon that not only burned hotter, but clung to surfaces, continuing to blaze long after impact. Unlike liquid gasoline, napalm did not splash or evaporate. It spread, it coated, and it suffocated. Inside the confined tunnels of the Pacific Islands, this meant total destruction. The Japanese defenders quickly realized that even sealing off cave entrances or using water-filled trenches could not stop the creeping wave of fire. These innovations were not created in sterile laboratories. They were born from battlefield demand. Every improvement came from after-action reports, written by men who had survived encounters deep inside volcanic rock. They suggested stronger valves, more flexible hoses, and better ignition systems. Some of these ideas were implemented within weeks. The Marines who carried the M2 often modified their own equipment, adding makeshift nozzles or field-engineered triggers to control fuel flow. It was a soldier's weapon, refined by the very people who risked their lives using it. But technology could not hide the moral question that hovered over every mission. Even as the flamethrower became more effective, it also became more controversial. The Geneva Conventions had not yet explicitly banned flame weapons, but their use was debated among Allied officers. Fire was ancient, primal, and uncontrollable. It symbolized a level of destruction that went beyond strategy and entered the realm of terror. Many American soldiers justified it by pointing to the enemy's fanaticism. The Japanese defenders rarely surrendered, and their ambush tactics killed thousands. If the flamethrower could end a battle faster and save American lives, then it was seen as a necessary evil. Yet some officers spoke candidly about its horror. Reports noted that after using flamethrowers, Marines often avoided entering the caves immediately. The scenes inside were too difficult to face. The weapon had turned the interior into a furnace, consuming everything. Even victory carried the smell of tragedy. In letters home, some men referred to themselves as firemen, a grim nickname that reflected both irony and discomfort. The war demanded they do what was needed, but no one could emerge from such work unchanged. For the Japanese side, the flame was more than a weapon. It was an insult to their warrior spirit. Bushido, the centuries-old code of honor, emphasized courage, purity of purpose, and the acceptance of death. To die by the sword was noble. To die by fire, unseen and unable to strike back, was unbearable. Survivors of the cave battles wrote in diaries later recovered that they prayed for quick deaths. Some officers even ordered their men to detonate grenades near their chests, rather than be consumed by flame. The flamethrower broke not only bodies, but belief itself. At the leadership level, both sides were forced to adapt quickly. American commanders like General Holland Smith and Admiral Chester Nimitz recognized that flame warfare, though horrific, was indispensable. It shortened sieges that might otherwise last weeks and cost tens of thousands of lives. Smith authorized mass production and distribution of flame units across Marine divisions, ensuring that every assault battalion had trained operators and dedicated support. The U.S. Navy also developed the CBH-1 and Ronson systems for tanks and amphibious vehicles, allowing them to project flame from relative safety. Japanese leadership, however, faced a different dilemma. They had no effective countermeasure. Their engineers tried to design flame-resistant bunkers using deeper tunnels, reinforced walls, and air shafts. But these adaptations came too late. The Americans learned to angle the nozzles, shooting flame upward into ventilation holes or around corners. Even if the fire did not reach the defenders directly, the heat and smoke turned the underground complex into a suffocating chamber. The defenders either burned or choked. By late 1944, the flamethrower had become both a tactical solution and a psychological weapon. Intelligence reports noted that Japanese resistance often collapsed faster in areas where flame tanks were deployed. The very sight of one rolling forward could trigger panic among defenders who once prided themselves on never retreating. For the Marines, this shift in morale marked a rare advantage. They had found something that pierced the enemy's legendary resolve. Still, there was no celebration in this success. Among those who fought, there was a shared understanding that victory had come at a terrible emotional price. Many Marines would later recall the silence that followed a flame assault, the quiet aftermath when all that remained was smoke and heat. VC, I would stand outside the caves, staring into the darkness, realizing what war had made them capable of. The flamethrower, in its terrible efficiency, had redefined the meaning of power in battle. It was a reminder that technology could make men stronger, but not necessarily better. It gave them dominance over the enemy's strongest defenses, but also exposed the fragility of their own humanity. Every shot of fire carried both triumph and loss. As the Pacific campaign neared its end, this duality would reach its peak on two islands that came to symbolize both victory and despair, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. In those final months, the range of the flamethrower would stretch beyond imagination, and its shadow would burn itself into the conscience of everyone who witnessed its power. February 19, 1945, Iwo Jima. A barren volcanic island barely 8 square miles in size, yet destined to become one of the bloodiest battlegrounds in American history. From the first wave of Marines landing on the black beaches, it was clear that this was no ordinary island. Every inch was fortified. Every cave concealed death. The Japanese defenders, nearly 21,000 strong under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had turned the island into a fortress beneath the earth. The opening bombardment by American naval guns had lasted for days, hurling thousands of tons of explosives at the island. Commanders believed few could have survived such destruction. But when the shelling stopped, silence returned, and from the caves came the sound of machine guns, mortars, and hidden artillery. The Japanese had barely been touched. Their tunnels extended for miles beneath the surface, connecting bunkers, command posts, and ambush positions. They emerged unharmed, ready to fight. The Marines soon discovered that no amount of conventional firepower could uproot these defenders. They attacked in waves, only to be met with hidden guns that opened and closed like the mouths of the island itself. The enemy seemed to vanish into stone. Men were being cut down in open ground, and every attempt to advance meant walking into invisible fire. The only answer was to go into the caves or burn them out. Flamethrower teams became the spearhead of the assault. Crawling forward under cover of smoke and debris, they aimed for the dark openings from which the gunfire came. When the trigger was pulled, the roar of the weapon drowned out all else. Streams of burning fuel shot into the tunnels, filling them with searing heat. Even the volcanic rock glowed red under the assault. Marines described how the flames reached around corners, bending through the air like a living thing. What shocked the defenders most was the reach. Many had believed their tunnels, dug deep and shielded by rock, were beyond the range of enemy fire. But the modified M2s and tank-mounted flame projectors reached more than 150 feet, their pressurized napalm bursting into the deepest caverns. Those who had once felt untouchable now found themselves surrounded by fire that flowed like liquid and consumed the air they breathed. The Japanese, trapped in their sanctuaries, had nowhere left to go. Each encounter followed a brutal rhythm. Riflemen covered the approach, then signaled the flamethrower forward. The operator, sweating under the weight of his tanks, advanced until the target was within range. One pull of the trigger, and the cave would erupt in a rolling explosion of light. Marines often waited several moments before moving closer, knowing that a single survivor could still emerge. When it was safe, demolition teams sealed the entrance with grenades or explosives. In many places, the island's rock was so scorched that it fused into glass. For 3 weeks, this cycle repeated across Iwo Jima's ridges and ravines. The famous Mount Suribachi became both a symbol of American victory and a graveyard for thousands. The flamethrowers and flame tanks were everywhere, clearing one cave after another, each taking its toll on the men who used them. Some Marines described how the roar of their weapon echoed long after they stopped firing, as if the island itself screamed back. General Kuribayashi's defense plan had been designed to bleed the Americans dry, to make them pay for every yard, and he succeeded. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed, and over 19,000 wounded. But the cost to his own forces was total. Fewer than 300 Japanese soldiers survived. The flamethrowers had done what artillery and bombs could not. They turned the underground city into an inferno, yet even in their effectiveness, they revealed something deeper about the nature of modern war. The Marines fought not against men alone, but against the will of a nation that refused to surrender. Every cave cleared was another small piece of that will extinguished, And still, it did not end. For beyond Iwo Jima lay Okinawa, a larger, more fortified island, where the same horrors would unfold on an even greater scale. The battle for Iwo Jima taught the Americans that victory in the Pacific would require more than courage. It demanded endurance, precision, and weapons capable of breaking the very environment in which the enemy hid. The flamethrower, once a desperate invention, had become the instrument of victory, and a symbol of the terrible extremes to which war could drive men. As the fires of Iwo Jima died down and the smoke cleared over the black sands, the Marines looked to the next horizon. Ahead waited Okinawa, the final stronghold before Japan itself. There, in the tunnels of the Shuri Line, the flame would once again become the decisive force in a battle unlike any before. April 1st, 1945. Okinawa. The largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War had begun. More than 180,000 American troops landed on the beaches of this long mountainous island. At first, they encountered little resistance. The beaches were quiet, almost eerily so. Some soldiers even wondered if the Japanese had abandoned the island. But beneath the hills, in the limestone ridges and labyrinthine tunnels of the Shuri Line, tens of thousands of defenders waited. General Mitsuru Ushijima had learned from Iwo Jima. He knew that survival meant going underground, waiting for the Americans to come to him. For days, the Marines advanced with cautious optimism, unaware of the storm that was about to erupt. When the Japanese finally opened fire, the entire southern part of the island exploded in flame, smoke, and steel. Artillery, mortars, and snipers struck from unseen positions. It was Iwo Jima magnified tenfold. More caves, deeper tunnels, more soldiers willing to die rather than yield. The hills themselves seemed alive, breathing death with every burst. The flamethrower units were called forward almost immediately. Okinawa's terrain, full of natural caves and man-made bunkers, made it nearly impossible for traditional assaults to succeed. Once again, it fell to the flame to do what bullets and bombs could not. The Marines knew the routine. Suppressive fire, mark the entrance, move the operator up, and burn everything within. But this time, the scale was staggering. Some cave systems stretched for hundreds of feet, connecting multiple firing points. The standard 100-foot range of the flamethrower was no longer enough. American engineers responded quickly, modifying both portable and vehicle-mounted flamethrowers in the field. The M4A3 Sherman Zippo became the weapon of choice. Its flame projector could send a stream of napalm over 150 feet into cave mouths and trenches. When several of these tanks fired together, the result was apocalyptic. Entire ridgelines erupted in rolling fire, their entrances glowing white-hot as smoke poured into the sky. The Japanese soldiers inside the Shuri caves were trapped in a nightmare. Their defensive strategy relied on waiting out the bombardments, then re-emerging to fight. But fire changed everything. The napalm sucked oxygen from the tunnels, creating a vacuum that turned the caves into furnaces. Even those deep within the system felt the heat. Some tried to dig new escape holes, only to be met with more flame from above. The Americans had learned to aim their projectors into ventilation shafts, turning every opening into a potential death trap. What made Okinawa different was the sheer number of civilians caught in the crossfire. Thousands had been forced by the Japanese to take refuge in the same caves used as defensive positions. When the flamethrowers fired, there was no way to distinguish soldier from civilian. The result was devastation beyond measure. American units reported finding entire families who had died in the inferno, victims of a war they could not escape. It was a tragedy that haunted many soldiers long after the island was secured. For the U.S. military, Okinawa became both a tactical success and a moral reckoning. The flamethrower proved once again to be one of the most effective weapons against entrenched defenders. It cleared positions quickly and reduced American casualties compared to direct assaults, but it also showed the terrible price of such effectiveness. The island's caves became tombs filled with ash, their walls blackened and fused. Even after the fighting ended, the smell of burned fuel and stone lingered for weeks. As the battle dragged into its third month, Japanese resistance became increasingly desperate. Soldiers launched suicide charges from burning caves, charging into machine gun fire rather than suffocating underground. The Americans responded with precision and overwhelming firepower. Every cave, every bunker, every crevice was methodically destroyed. When it was over, Okinawa was left in ruins. Nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, along with tens of thousands of civilians. The United States had lost more than 12,000 of its own. The success of flame warfare on Okinawa confirmed what American commanders already suspected. If an invasion of mainland Japan ever took place, it would be a bloodbath beyond imagination. The caves and tunnels that honeycombed the home islands would make Okinawa look small. Plans were drawn to produce thousands more flamethrowers and flame tanks for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. But history took another turn. The atomic bombs would end the war before those weapons were ever used again. Yet for those who had fought on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the memory of fire was eternal. They had seen the weapon that could burn through rock and steel, that could consume entire worlds of darkness. The flamethrower had won battles, but it had also scarred everyone who witnessed its power. It was both victory and burden, a reminder that in the Pacific, survival often demanded becoming something less than human, if only for a moment. As the flames died and Okinawa fell silent, the world prepared. When the fires of Okinawa finally dimmed in late June 1945, the Pacific was a landscape of ruin. The blackened caves, melted stones, and twisted remains of bunkers stood as silent monuments to the ferocity of modern war. American engineers and photographers who entered the burned-out tunnels days after the fighting ended described scenes that defied comprehension. The air was heavy with the scent of charred fuel and human ash. Rifles lay fused to the rock walls. Helmets were melted into the ground. Nothing living remained. For the United States, Okinawa was both a triumph and a warning. The campaign had proven that Japanese resistance could be broken, but only through unimaginable destruction. In the report sent to Washington, commanders highlighted the effectiveness of flamethrowers and napalm in clearing entrenched positions. Yet behind every tactical success was a moral cost that weighed heavily on the men who carried those weapons. Many flamethrower operators suffered lasting trauma. They had faced enemies at point-blank range, often seeing the aftermath of their own fire. Some could never forget the screams that echoed through the caves or the smell of burning flesh that clung to their uniforms. A Marine from the 4th Division later recalled, "You didn't just kill them, you erased them. The fire left nothing to bury." Military analysts, however, saw the weapon's undeniable value. In technical terms, the flamethrower was extraordinarily efficient. It could neutralize fortified positions with minimal ammunition and fewer friendly casualties. Reports estimated that on Okinawa alone, flame units destroyed over 1,200 enemy positions that artillery or small arms could not reach. For every cave sealed by fire, dozens of American lives were spared from frontal assaults. These results transformed U.S. strategic thinking in the final months of the war. As plans were drawn for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese mainland, the Army and Marine Corps requested massive increases in flame weapons production. Factories in the United States began turning out improved models, including the M9A1 portable flamethrower with a longer range and higher pressure. The Navy ordered new flame tanks and aircraft capable of delivering napalm strikes. By August 1945, enough equipment had been prepared to outfit entire divisions with flame capability. But before those weapons could be used, a new and far deadlier form of destruction arrived. On August 6th and 9th, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki rendered the planned invasion unnecessary. Japan surrendered within weeks. The war that had burned through the jungles and caves of the Pacific ended not with fire from flamethrowers, but with fire from the sky. Yet, the legacy of those flame battles endured. American soldiers returning home carried memories that could not be extinguished. Many spoke of the flamethrower not as a weapon of victory, but as a symbol of what war forces men to become. Its power was unmatched in close combat, but its use left psychological scars that time could not heal. Even in post-war training manuals, the Army acknowledged the psychological effect of the weapon, both on the enemy and the operator. In Japan, the burned caves of Iwo Jima and Okinawa became sacred ground. Locals and historians later discovered bones fused with glass and rock, the remnants of soldiers who had refused to surrender for decades. Japanese recovery teams entered those tunnels to collect the remains of the dead, often finding melted helmets and relics of battle sealed beneath layers of ash. The contrast between triumph and tragedy defined the aftermath. On paper, the flamethrower had been one of America's most successful weapons of the Pacific War. But in human terms, it revealed the unbearable cost of total warfare, a form of fighting that turned men into wielders of elemental destruction. And as historians looked back, they saw something else in those smoldering caves, a preview of what the modern age of war would become, where technology would make killing more efficient, but never less personal. In the months following Japan's surrender, U.S. military investigators returned to the battlefields of Iwo Jima and Okinawa to document the effectiveness of every weapon used. Their findings confirmed what the soldiers already knew. No other ground weapon had such an immediate psychological and physical impact as the flamethrower. Enemy prisoners repeatedly described a single moment of panic whenever the sound of the igniter hissed through the air. For them, the weapon represented a fate worse than death. It was not only destruction, but erasure. The official reports were clinical, written in the detached language of engineering and tactics. They spoke of range, fuel efficiency, ignition pressure, and area coverage. But beneath the data, there was an unspoken truth. The flamethrower had been as much a psychological instrument as a physical one. It didn't just burn positions, it broke willpower. Japanese soldiers who would otherwise fight to the death sometimes chose suicide when confronted with its terrifying reach. Others simply froze in shock, unable to comprehend how fire could move with such precision inside their tunnels. In post-war Tokyo, Japanese military analysts quietly studied these reports. Some survivors of the cave garrisons later gave testimony to historians. They spoke of the unbearable heat, the roar of flame flooding through stone corridors, and the instant collapse of morale among those trapped inside. One described it as the fire of the gods, unstoppable and all-consuming. For Japan's future military thinkers, the lesson was clear. The era of fixed defense in caves or bunkers was over. No amount of bravery could resist that kind of firepower. Meanwhile, in the United States, the flamethrower quickly became an emblem of the Pacific War's brutality. It appeared in newsreels and photographs, iconic images of Marines carrying heavy tanks on their backs, arcs of flame cutting across the battlefield. For civilians, these images symbolized victory through strength. But for veterans, they carried a darker meaning. Many who had operated flamethrowers refused to speak about their experiences at all. Some destroyed their wartime photographs or equipment after returning home. In veterans' hospitals, nightmares of fire were common, even decades later. The ethical debate surrounding flamethrowers grew after the war. Humanitarian organizations and some military leaders began questioning whether the weapon should remain in use. The sight of fire consuming entire positions, especially with civilians often nearby, challenged moral boundaries even in wartime. The Geneva Conventions did not yet ban flamethrowers, but the discussion marked a turning point in how humanity viewed weapons of extreme destruction. During the Korean War and early years of Vietnam, flamethrowers reappeared, though their role gradually shifted from close combat to clearing vegetation and fortifications. The lessons learned from Iwo Jima and Okinawa remained the foundation of their tactics, but technology had evolved. Napalm, liquid fire dropped from aircraft, became the new face of the same terrifying principle. The spirit of the flamethrower had merely taken flight. By the late 1970s, most Western armies phased out the weapon entirely. It was too heavy, too dangerous for its users, and too politically toxic to justify. Yet the image of the flamethrower operator, silhouetted against burning stone, endured in collective memory. It stood as a reminder of how far human ingenuity would go to survive, and how much of its own humanity it could sacrifice in the process. Today, the caves of Iwo Jima and Okinawa remain preserved as war memorials. Visitors walk through the dark tunnels where once the fires roared, their walls still blackened and scarred. In those silent spaces, it's impossible not to feel the echoes of both sides, the Americans who fought to end the war, and the Japanese soldiers who believed they were defending their homeland to the last breath. The flamethrower may have vanished from modern arsenals, but its shadow lingers wherever war forces men into desperate corners. It reminds us that even in victory, there are wounds that never cool, and memories that never lose their heat. The story of the flamethrower in the Pacific is not just about a weapon. It is about what war does to the human soul. In the jungles and volcanic caves of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, men learned that survival sometimes meant wielding forces they could barely comprehend. Fear, the oldest element of destruction, became their ally and their curse. It burned through stone, steel, and flesh, but it also seared itself into memory. Those who carried the tanks on their backs bore not only weight and danger, but the burden of what their fire would leave behind. In military history, the flamethrower marked a turning point. It closed the age of hand-to-hand valor and opened the age of mechanical devastation. The caves once thought invincible proved vulnerable to heat and pressure, teaching every army on Earth that no fortress was truly safe. Yet the lesson came with a haunting cost. The weapon's effectiveness could not erase the faces of those it consumed, or the silence that followed its roar. Long after the Pacific War ended, veterans spoke softly of what they had seen. Some justified it as necessity. Others simply called it horror. In their words lay the eternal contradiction of modern warfare, the triumph of innovation and the tragedy of its use. The flamethrower had achieved what it was designed to do, to clear, to conquer, to save American lives. But it had also revealed a truth that no strategy could disguise, that victory by fire changes everyone who survives it,